Now it's time that we turn our attention to the fold down portion of our outfeed table. Now there's a number of different construction techniques that we can use for this application. And it really depends on how strong, sturdy, and rigid you want it to be. Now you could of course just start out by hinging on a piece of 1/2-inch birch plywood, for example, and that would serve fine for light duty use. For something a little bit more heavy duty, you could make a frame to support that 1/2-inch plywood. Now in this case, we've got 1/2-inch perimeter framing, and I would run some cross ribbing underneath as well, pretty much in the same pattern as we show on the drawings. And I would put the top surface as either 1/2-inch or 3/4-inch birch plywood. Now keep in mind that the more wood and the thicker the plywood that you add, the heavier it will get. An alternative to heavy plywood is to create a torsion box, similar to how we did with the fixed portion of the outfeed table. Now on the swing down portion, we do want to keep it lightweight. And a nice, strong, sturdy, rigid structure that we can create is, of course, a torsion box. Now in this case, this little sample, we've created the framework as well as what would be the internal ribbing out of the 1/2-inch birch plywood, and then we skinned the box using 1/4-inch thick hardboard, also known as masonite. Now this will work out real well. It'll be fairly light. It should stay flat over time. Torsion boxes can warp, but generally they don't. You won't really be able to clamp anything on here unless you're clamping directly over your ribbing or the perimeter framing. If you clamp somewhere in the middle of the field area, you'll just simply collapse it. So those are two economical options to the swing down portion of the table. For our table, we're going with a very, very heavy duty system. As I mentioned at the top of this story, I use this outfeed table not only as work support for feeding out on both the router table and the table saw, but also as an auxiliary workbench. And because of that, I want it to stay flat over time. I don't want to concern myself with it warping and so forth. And I want it to be a very strong structure. So I've turned to an industrial product. This is from the manufacturer called 8020 Inc. It's extruded aluminum, similar to the T-track material that we use on various accessories in the shop. However, this is much more heavy duty. The particular size that we selected for our framing is 1 inch thick, 2 inches wide. And it has the T-slots on all the surfaces. And we use those T-slots along with these extruded aluminum brackets to create the joints between each of the pieces. Now I'll be explaining how you can buy this from a couple different suppliers, ourselves as well as another supplier, a little bit later in the story. However, the nice feature about this, we're going to get a tremendous amount of strength. In fact, over the full length of the longest rail that we have on this outfeed table, a 200-pound weight placed at the exact center of it is only going to give us about 3/16 of an inch of deflection. So it's going to be incredibly strong. It's also very easy to work with. If you purchase the kit from us, all the pieces are already cut to size for you and you just have to bolt it together. And it works very much like the erector set you played with as a kid. Now we're going to be skinning our outfeed table with 1/2-inch thick plywood. Again, I want the strength. I want to be able to assemble things on here, work on it and so forth, and not worry about breaking or penetrating through a thin 1/4-inch either hardboard or 1/4-inch plywood, for example. So we've got our 1/2-inch thick plywood for our top skin, and then this extruded aluminum for the framework. Now we'll go about showing you how to work with this material. Now if you choose to go with the options of a torsion box or a wood-framed 1/2-inch thick plywood skinned table, the construction and assembly techniques are exactly the same as the fixed portion of our outfeed table. Just glue the skins in place, tack them down with some brads of the appropriate length, and you're all set. To join together the perimeter framework, we're going to be using this double-wide angle bracket. It's just a matter of inserting your screws with your T-nut, and then we'll slide them in place and tighten up the screws. Joining the 1 inch by 1 inch material that serves as our cross ribbing, we'll be using the single wide brackets. And again, T-nuts and Allen head screws, and we just clamp those in place. Now to attach the plywood to our aluminum frame, we're going to be using these other aluminum brackets. And they'll just simply require one T-nut along with an Allen screw, and we'll slide that in and then use a sheet metal screw to hold the plywood to the bracket. Now I'll start out by laying out the location of our 1" by 1" ribbing that goes in the field area. Now because these fasteners will all fit in the same T-slot, we have to assemble things in order, and it works best to work from the center out. Now the first thing I did was I slid in one of my tabletop fasteners. Now I'll slide in one of the little fasteners that's going to hold in one of the ribs, and then another tabletop fastener. And I'll repeat this all the way around until I get all of my fasteners positioned where I want them. Working along one edge, I'll go ahead and start tightening up all the angle brackets, and while I'm doing that, I want to make sure that I hold the two pieces of aluminum down flat against our table surface. With the one side already all attached, now we need to bring the other rail into position, and we have to line up all these T-nuts with the appropriate T-slots. It can be a bit of a challenge, but if you take your time, it should work out fine. I also found that by snugging up the brackets against the long rail first helped out a lot, because I don't have to try and balance that portion of it as I'm doing this. And now we can center up our brackets, tighten them up, and attach the top skin, which is our 1/2" plywood, using number 8 by 1/2" long sheet metal screws with a washer. Now we're ready to turn our attention to the legs. We want fold-up legs because this is a fold-down shelf. Now the hardware that I've selected all comes from a company called Rockler. They're a woodworking supplier, and we're going to need a chair glide, a T-nut, and one of their leg mounting brackets. Now the material I'm using for my legs is 1.5" square oak, the same material I had that I used for my brace at the back of the fixed portion. Now we'll go through the steps showing you how to get the legs measured up and how to fit them up to your table. What I'm doing now is measuring for the overall length of the legs. It's 34 7/8 inches up to the top surface of my table saw. Now I've gone through and made sure that my table saw is level, and it's of course relatively parallel to the floor. Now my top thickness is 2.5 inches, so I'll need to subtract that 2.5 inch top thickness from the leg length. Now there's one more subtraction we'll have to make, and we'll show you that with the hardware. At the foot end, we're going to be using these chair glides. They're 5/16 18 threaded, and I've also purchased some jam nuts, and those will help hold the foot at its proper length. Now to install it, I'm going to be using these triangular screw-in T-nuts. And we would of course put that up in that hole and then drive in 3 screws to help stabilize it. Now so that I have adjustment in height, I'm going to subtract 1.25 inches from the overall length of my leg to account for this foot area. Setting up a drill press to drill into the end of a long board can be a bit troublesome, but these are some little points that might help you along the way. Now I have a long steel rod that I use for setup on the drill press. I chuck that up on the drill, and then I'll lower my quill down and lock that in place. Now I'll swing my table over and then keep wiggling it back and forth until it lines up perfectly parallel with that rod. That tells me that the table is now perfectly parallel to the center line of the spindle. I want to just clamp on a block, a piece of scrap, that's parallel to that drill bit. And the width of this block should be greater than the center line distance of where we want to drill that hole. It's really an arbitrary value or arbitrary width, because we're just going to use this as a guide to help us with the next piece. Now we'll clamp on another piece of scrap that's running parallel to that board. I've placed a 1/2 inch drill back in the drill chuck, and now what I've got is my leg clamped on here. Now you'll notice there's a gap over here, and that's fine. And I've got the leg clamped to the table. Now what I'll do is I'll swing the leg back and forth, as well as the drill press table, and adjust the clamp until I line up with a mark that I've made on the end of the leg showing me the center line position. Now with our table clamped in place, With the leg clamped in directly underneath the center line of the drill bit, what I want to do is measure this gap, and it should be even all the way down. That tells me that my leg is square to the center line of the drill bit in this axis. Now we've got the two clamps holding our leg in place, and we can drill our hole. And to accommodate the full threaded portion of our foot, we need to drill in 1.5 inches. Now we can install the T-nut, and we'll start out by tapping that in. Then using a 3/32 inch drill bit, I'll drill the pilot holes for our screws. And the screws are included with the hardware. And now we can thread in the chair glide along with our jam nut. And we can actually even set its height at 1.25 inches. Now in order to use these mounting brackets like so, we need to create some blocking that will give us a mounting position. Now this blocking, it's really nothing more than a piece of scrap of the cutoff portion of my leg, and then I attached a piece of 1/2 inch plywood to the bottom of it, and that provides a nice flange for mounting it in position. You can really just create anything you want here, and depending on the type of table you're using, such as a sheet of plywood or the wood framed one, or even the torsion box style with the hardboard skins, you will have to allow for blocking to support this bracket. Now I don't want my legs right out here at the corner. If I set them back from the front edge a little bit, there's much less chance of my foot kicking them as the table's folded down. So I'm going to set mine back about we'll say 3 inches from the front edge. Now the mounting and the structure of this little bracket here really is up to you. You can come up with any combination that you want. Now we need to position our mounting bracket, and I want the outside edge of the leg flush with the outside edge of the aluminum. Mark my hole locations. Now we can drill the pilot holes and install the bracket. And now I can repeat the process to mount the leg to the bracket. Now if your Outfeed table is narrower than this model, you can still accommodate the same type of leg system, but what you'll have to do is offset them front to back of each other. And then that way when they come down, they'll pass by each other. Now with that step out of the way, we can go to the final step, and that's to hinge our fold down table to the fixed portion. There's a number of different choices for hinges to hinge our swing down table to the fixed table. We could use a nice large door hinge. Now these would work out great if both pieces are made out of wood. However, with the hole patterns that are on here, it's not going to work out real well for this type of extruded aluminum. So what I've gone to is 1.5 inches, or rather, I'm sorry, a 3-inch utility hinge. Now you'll notice that I've greatly enlarged this hole. To do that, over at the drill press, I installed a countersink and then clamped the hinge in a vise. And then just carefully kept drilling in at a slow RPM until that hole was large enough so that it would accommodate our flat head screw. And that's what we're going to use it to attach the hinge to this aluminum T-track. Now I'll slide the hinge in so that the outside edge is 5 inches in from the end. And I'll be using a total of 3 hinges, one at each end and one in the center. Now this next step is extremely critical because what it's going to do is set up the alignment between our fixed shelf and our swing down shelf. So this measurement has to be exact. Now what we want to do is measure down from the top edge of our table to the top edge of the hinge. And that will tell us how far down to place the hinge on our fixed shelf. Now if you have a dial caliper and you know how to use one of these, you may want to use the dial caliper to make this measurement. And that will just greatly increase your accuracy. Now as you can see, I've made layout marks showing me the left to right position of the hinge. And then we made that measurement from the top surface down, and I'm using my caliper, and I'll do the same here. Just transfer that dimension down, and that'll show me where the top edge of that hinge should be once we get it installed. With the hole locations marked, I can use a scratch awl to create an indentation which will help guide my drill as I create the pilot holes. A 5/64 inch drill bit works out fine for the screws that came with my hinges. Now with our swing down table resting on top of some shims, we can go ahead and drive the screws in to our fixed portion. Well, that feels a lot more comfortable feeding stock when you know you've got good support at the outfeed end. Now, no matter which construction technique you follow for your outfeed table, take your time, make it flat, make it straight, make it square, and pay very careful attention to making sure that you get all of your levels set just right so that as you feed your stock out, it doesn't catch on anything because you didn't take the time to keep it good and flat. Now the last thing that I'll do with my table is I'll sand it up, put on a couple of coats of a water-based polyurethane, and if needed I'll throw on a coat of wax. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. Thanks for watching.